free and fair elections. They want a representative government. They want a responsive government. And so what we've said is you have to start a transition now. Mubarak's already decided he's not running for re-election again. His term is up this year. And what we've said is let's make sure that you get all the groups together in Egypt, let the Egyptian people make a determination what's the process for an orderly transition, but one that is a meaningful transition.
Also watching, waiting and praying about what happens next, the people of Egypt and the thousands of demonstrators in Liberation Square who've promised not to leave until Mubarak does. John Terrett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, Mark Perry is a military and foreign affairs analyst and the author of Talking to Terrorists, Why America Must Engage with Its Enemies. He joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Mark Perry, what do you make of these talks between opposition groups that include the Muslim Brotherhood and the Egyptian government? And why is there this presumably inherent fear of the Muslim Brotherhood in Washington?
Well, you see it every day in our press. You see it in our people. People are very tentative, even policymakers. You have to understand that for 30 years we've been talking to Hosni Mubarak and his regime and nobody else. We haven't engaged with the Muslim Brotherhood. We haven't really engaged with any of the opposition. So whenever we pick up the phone in Washington, that's who we talk to, and this has taken us by surprise. So, as your reporter said, we're walking a tightrope, and that's, I'm afraid, that's the way it's been and probably will be for a while.
What about, Mark, the widening impact of this crisis? I mean, some experts say it's perhaps highlighted the imperceptible cracks in U.S. Middle Eastern foreign policy. Would you agree with that?
I agree very strongly. We see in the administration and almost when you're in these policy meetings in the administration, people bring up Israel. There are people who roll their eyes. This isn't the major concern. Israel isn't our major concern. While the pro-partisan, pro-Israeli people in our society want to make Israel the concern, this is really a story of American values and American democracy, and that's got to be our primary focus. And I think that's coming through more and more. Even among very pro-Israel partisans, there's an understanding here that our values in our political system is much more at stake, and Israel's a secondary concern.
And that's a crucial point you make, Mark, because the possibility of a new Egyptian leadership containing the Muslim Brotherhood must have had Washington's pro-Israel lobby perhaps scrambling for cover. I mean, what is America's foreign policy here? Is it democracy or is it support for Israel? I mean, does America have to choose?
I don't think that America has to choose anything but what it's always been in favor of. And wouldn't it be nice to see a president of the United States stand up? And I think that Barack Obama wants to do this. I felt that today watching him on Fox News. He wants to stand up and say unequivocally, we're with the people in the square. We're for democracy. That's an absolute reflection of our values. And that would get him off the high wire, and that would put him right squarely in favor of where I think the American people are, and that is in favor of their values.
So how do you assess this shift in change in U.S. policy in the region? I mean, is Israel likely to lose out long term, or is Washington shift its focus to democracy and values over security? I mean, how do you assess that shift?
I think that there's a real exaggeration about the impact that this will have on American relations with Israel and on Israel. And I think that Mr. Netanyahu is late to this game, but he seems to now be catching up. Democracy and more democracies in the Middle East are the one way to assure Israel's security. Dictatorships won't ever do that, can't ever do that. And I think if we focus on that squares the circle. That resolves the debate.
Do you think this crisis in Egypt has caught the U.S. regional leaders on the hop?
Yeah, I think it was quite a surprise, but we should have seen it coming. You know, these dictatorships are untenable. Their economic crisis is very deep. Their governments are bankrupt. The people there really want democracy and freedom of speech. We've seen this on the streets of Cairo. I think we have to get out ahead of this. Whether we saw it coming or not is now a part of history. Now that it's there, it's not going to go away, and we have to be with the pro-democracy people in Egypt and across the region.
You mentioned this possible response, these possible worries and concerns from Israel. How do you assess, Mark, the back channels now between Washington and Israel? What are they talking about in terms of what's going to happen in terms of the new leadership coming out of this crisis in Egypt?
I think the message from Washington is very clear here, and I think that Washington policymakers are even telling themselves this. There are two things that we haven't seen. We haven't seen the burning of Uncle Sam in Tahrir Square. We haven't seen that Islam is the answer, signs Islam is the answer. And I think that we're telling Israel very plainly and bluntly, stay out of this. The more you meddle, the worse it'll get. Let's back democracy. You're a democracy. You're not the only democracy in the Middle East. You're about to have another one. That can only be good news.
All right, Mark Perry there in Washington, D.C. Mark, always good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, an Al Jazeera correspondent who was detained while covering the unrest has been released. Ayman Mohyeddin was seized by the Egyptian military near Tahrir Square in Cairo on Sunday, but freed 9 hours later. Dozens of journalists have been detained, injured and threatened while covering the current crisis. Well, Nadia El Awadi is president of the World Federation of Science Journalists. She told us about her own experience.
Actually, on the day that people watched horses and camels raid Tahrir Square, I was standing filming that event. And as I was filming, a woman yelled at other protesters, telling them that I was filming the Yes to Mubarak group. And suddenly a man came behind me, pretty much pounced on me, grabbed my camera from my hands and broke it. That was early, actually, in that morning. And then afterwards, for the next few days, we continued to hear about journalists being attacked in various ways, whether they were Egyptian or foreign journalists.
Well, joining us on the phone now is the well-known Egyptian blogger Mahmoud Salem, also known as Sand Monkey. Mahmoud, we understand that you were beaten up on Thursday by security forces. Just tell us briefly what happened.
Basically, I was trying to get medical supplies to people in Tahrir. They told me to go to Talat Harb because that's the easier way to get in and safest. It wasn't. I was attacked by mobile guns with tire wrenches, breaking my windows of my car. So I escaped and I ran in downtown with the car. I found 5 police officers. I stopped by them, asking for their help. They take my keys, they take my phones, and then they incite the crowds, who were, a lot of them were plainclothes policemen, because we could see like their guns under their shirt to attack us.
Do you think?
And beat us up and destroyed my car, beat up the girls. I had 2 girls with me, 1 dude. I was beaten up everywhere. My car got completely destroyed. My car doesn't exist anymore. Basically, it lasted for 35 minutes. The destruction of my car and the beating of us up. And they threatened to lynch us, and they threatened to flip the car with us in it, and it was not fun.
Mahmoud, do you think that you and other bloggers like yourself are perhaps being watched closely by Egyptian security services?
Probably, very much so. But I don't think I got attacked that day because I was a blogger. I believe that because they attacked everybody who was bringing supplies that day. And they also attacked lots of journalists. But I think I was targeted for carrying the supplies that day.
And what sort of supplies were you carrying into the square on Thursday?
Basically, lots of medical supplies. I mean, there was about 1,000 people injured and 9 people who died, and we need lots of alcohol to clear the wounds, strings to close the wounds, you know, lots of first aid stuff and painkillers, basically.
How are you using the internet and blogging services in terms of staying in touch with protesters, with people who want to get their stories out to the wider world? How are you using your blog to do that?
Well, basically what we do is we use social media in order to disseminate information. We have the state-owned media, which has turned completely into a propaganda machine, accusing everybody of being a traitor and a foreign agent. You have the semi-independent news channels, and they're split in half. Some are with the protesters, the others are spreading the lies of the government. And then you have international media like Al Jazeera and CNN and BBC, and they've been mostly very honest about the message. But in order for us to organize locally or send information out locally, social media becomes the easiest way to share that kind of information to everybody.
And what's the mood in Tahrir Square now? I mean, when were you last down there?
I was there yesterday, and it has become a tent city. Basically, people are living there. They're happy. Like yesterday, there was a wedding there. You know, there's a couple who's spending their honeymoon there. You know, they already have apparently like music scheduled. There's already like lots of vendors. I'm imagining it's very similar to the March 8th downtown protest in Lebanon in terms of how it became its own mini city in the middle of downtown.
All right, Mahmoud Salem, Moulton.